Hey everyone, wanted to provide you an update here on some of the things I'm watching. We're looking down at the visible satellite imagery across the eastern Pacific, the western United States. You can see California here with some rain showers. You can see some of those clouds there moving in on the satellite imagery up into Oregon, the Willamette Valley. Seeing rain showers here this Wednesday during the day here through the lunch hour. Rain all the way through Northern California. We'll take a look at that, but it is cool to look down at this eastern Pacific satellite imagery. You can see the low pressure system spinning here up in the northeast Pacific. If you look to the west, there's another low pressure system we'll be keeping an eye on. That's going to play a role in the forecast. This one's spinning out here kind of due northeast of Hawaii here, and I think that's going to bring some more inclement weather a day or two out here. So we'll get into that in the forecast as well. I want to show you some of the radar imagery. So this is looking right down. I think we're just getting here to the new hour here across the west coast. Rain moving through Northern California, rain moving through Oregon, western Washington, some sprinkles of rain showers now trying to get into the Central Valley itself. Probably some rain falling here in the North Valley. Look a little bit further to the south, not as much rain getting in here into the San Joaquin Valley, and then some rain just now trying to get into the San Francisco Bay Area here at the lunch hour. So another one of these systems coming through, this one kind of more pushing toward the north. We talked last week about how with this Pacific Jet extension coming across the Pacific, this first system or two would likely focus more on the northwestern U.S., and then potentially later in the week, we'd get that jet stream become a little bit further south, bring one of these systems through. We'd get the Central Valley involved, you get the southern central coast of California, or even southern California and Arizona involved in that, and perhaps some Sierra snowfall as well. The Sierras are actually running below average here kind of through the first quarter of the water year. Not a huge concern in terms of the entire water year all the way looking out. There's plenty of time to make up for that, but it is something I'm keeping an eye on, because if you start low, that's a good way to finish low sometimes. But again, we have all of January, all of February, all of March to make up for that. Not something I'm too concerned about yet. And let's look at the forecast, because I think there's going to be some snowfall in the forecast here. This is looking down. This is the jet stream level winds right here, right now across the Pacific. I'm showing this because if you look to the west on this map, this is Japan, and this is what we mean by a Pacific jet extension. You've extended these strong Pacific jet stream winds almost all the way over here to California. I mean, you can draw the line with these strong winds, and you're making about 80% of the way. That is a big extension across the Pacific. We track these in winter to bring rainfall, snow, often wind to the west coast of the U.S. I have to say, this one is, I'll admit, a little bit of a letdown. We see some of these events come through, and they bring a lot more precipitation, a lot more rain to some parts of the Sierra Nevadas. They help out the water year in a big way. This one's certainly bringing rainfall to Northern California. They're getting quite a bit of that today. Some rain for the Northwest as well. But just kind of the nature of the moisture, kind of the antecedent moisture across the Pacific getting spun up into some of these systems hasn't. We're not getting the most bang for our buck from the system, but there will likely be more to watch in kind of this El Nino background state. Nonetheless, additional rainfall expected. Let's get right into the forecast here. This is the GFS. We're looking at this here. Modeled rainfall going out into the future here. This valid right here at the lunch hour on Wednesday. There's the rain we just looked at. So doing well so far. That rain through Northern California. Some rain showers in the Willamette Valley, western Washington as well. If I take this through this evening, you can see that pushing into the Bay Area. We just saw that kind of getting started on that radar imagery we just looked at, including some rainfall getting into the North Valley as well. Perhaps can't rule out some rain showers getting through the central coastline as well, but that's likely lingering into the morning tomorrow, what I'm showing you now. And that second low pressure system, remember the one a little bit further to the west that I showed you in that first loop that we looked at of the visible satellite imagery? That one's going to start coming onshore here as we go through the day Friday, impacting Northern California again. They're more under the gun in this system. Parts of the Willamette Valley getting additional rainfall going through Friday night into Saturday morning. If you look at the Central Valley of California, if you look at the central coastline, an area that dealt with some unfortunate flooding last week, expecting more rainfall there as we go through this weekend, particularly overnight Friday and then into Saturday morning. And that's trying to push all the way through Southern California, the Los Angeles area, all the way down through San Diego. Some snowfall likely coming to the Sierra Nevadas, potentially the Central Valley getting some rainfall as well as this system spins up into the area. So that is what I'll be watching as we go through the day Saturday, finally clearing out later in the day Saturday going into Sunday, and potentially followed by another one of these quick systems moving through Southern California sometime on Monday. This one, not as high confidence. We're getting a little bit further out in the forecast, and it's a pretty quick mover, so not a huge rainfall event, but seeing a potential additional shot of snowfall in Southern California. Snowfall, rainfall, perhaps some snow in the highest elevations there. Additional rainfall, and then keeping an eye on a potential midweek system, 7-day forecast now at this point, but an additional system all the way out as we get into the midweek of next week here. So that kind of takes us out to the 7 days. Certainly some systems to watch here. If we just look at the next kind of 2 systems we're following, this one here today, the additional rainfall from that, and then that next one coming through on the weekend, all the way out to kind of halfway through Monday. You can see Northern California expecting the most rainfall out of this. This is the National Weather Service Weather Prediction Center's forecast for rainfall here and precipitation. Northern California seeing potentially 2 to 3, likely higher amounts locally in some of the elevation areas. And in the central coastline of California, seeing even more rainfall here, 1-2 inches. Again, some of those mountainous regions could go 2, 3, maybe even 4 inches of rainfall. That's how you get some flooding concerns, unfortunately, kind of getting reintroduced to some of these areas, particularly in the coastal areas where the water gets funneled down quickly to some of the valleys. So we'll be keeping an eye on that as we go through the weekend here. And then that little kind of skater system coming through here, potentially getting San Diego in the mix. Prediction right now here, just a 1/3 of an inch of rainfall. But nonetheless, it's something with higher amounts getting up toward the Los Angeles area. And then the Sierra Nevadas, this will not fall as rain, it'll fall as snow. We'll take a look at that just a slide here. This is the National Blend of Models, their forecast for snowfall. So when I started this, I talked about Sierra Nevada. We're running below average for the year. We need to kind of pack up that snow as we go through January here. This is not going to get us all the way there. Looking at maybe a foot plus of snowfall here. Certainly a nice top off. We're going to need some more of these to get us back toward average, and I'll be looking out at that in the forecast as we go through the month of January and then into February as well. It's one thing here, we're at the end of December, but if we get into early February, we're still running this deficit. Now there's kind of a bigger concern that's going to persist all the way to the next growing season. So this is definitely something I'll be watching more and more under a closer inspection going through the new year, getting into 2024. Wanted to get an update on the Madden-Julian oscillation, or the MJO as we call it. We talked about this black line here. This is the historical MJO over the last 2 to 3 weeks. This yellow spaghetti plot, as we call it here, it kind of looks like a plate of spaghetti. Those are all the different forecast models going out into the future. We've talked about all the way through December that when we get these extensions that we had, this is the 10th of December through the 14th, 16th through the Christmas time, these extensions through the Pacific Ocean tends to bring more rain events, more storms, more low pressure systems to follow, rainfall to the forecast for perhaps California, Washington, etc. And that ended up the case. We've had plenty of rain to talk about. We have systems here today as this extension has helped extend that Pacific jet stream. The MJO has made its way through the Pacific, and now it's finally starting to leave to go back into the Eastern Hemisphere, back into the Indian Ocean. And this reset here in early January, likely to at some point kind of quiet things down a little bit, less systems likely to talk about as it does that. So that's kind of one thing I'll be watching as we go into January, to perhaps get a brief break in some of these kind of incessant system after system rainfall events that we've been watching, even though they haven't been the most productive in terms of snowfall for some of these mountainous regions. If we get just the next 7 days of rainfall as a departure from average, this is one of the rainiest times of the year for the West Coast. Be mindful of that when I say departure from average. This takes us through January 5th, so the next about 7 days here. And see more rainfall expected, more than average for the coastal areas of California. Again, some of these areas dealing with flooding just last week, so there's additional concern going through the weekend into Monday. Potentially a midweek system as well could reintroduce some flooding to these areas. I will say these aren't the most kind of potent rainstorms. It's not a huge concern, but again, to get some of these localized areas, they get enough rainfall falling in a short enough time period, as we saw in kind of the Santa Barbara area, bad things can happen pretty quickly. But if you look to the north, we've been drier across the northwest. That trend expected to continue. Some rain, will likely fall despite this kind of very drier kind of area on the color bar here. But that's because even if you get a little bit of rain in that area, this is again one of the rainiest times of the year where we deliver a lot of that budget of our water, our annual rainfall. So if you're just getting these light rain amounts, it can end up showing up drier than average on these forecasts when you do it by departure there. But Southern California, certainly over the next 7 days, looking at potential rainfall events to follow along with here. Kind of reversing the timeline here, this is actually just looking at the last 14 days of rainfalls for their departure from average. And it looks kind of similar to the forecast I just showed you. A lot of rain for the Central California coastline, up through parts of Northern California, some areas of the North Valley, some areas of Southern California. But then you see for some of these systems, they haven't been the best producing snow in the Sierra Nevadas, and we're actually running drier here despite all these systems we've had to talk about over the last 14 days. And there's the Northwest, drier than average with some of these systems coming through as well, and that forecast expected to continue here. This is kind of an El Nino look. We talked about a kind of textbook El Nino winter. We get more of these systems coming through California or Southern California and Arizona, and less systems up here. So at least right now, the kind of El Nino textbook playing out, and we kind of saw that in the forecast just a slide ago as well. One thing that we've been talking about is the potential for some cold weather in January. Still kind of keeping an eye on that. There are still some hints of that lingering in the forecast. Nothing too concrete. What we're looking at here is the upper level height map at 500 millibars. This getting an idea of where the ridges might end up, where the troughs might end up. Kind of a quick crash course here. These ridges tend to bring in warm weather. These troughs here tend to bring in rain at the front of these systems and cold weather in and behind them. So that's what we're kind of watching for in terms of where's the cold air going to come from. Well, if I take this forecast out into early January, and I'll take this all the way out to the end of next week, so not this weekend, kind of getting into next weekend. This is the GFS ensemble. It's forecasting a pretty potent trough here across the western U.S. This would certainly bring about some very cold temperatures because it's coming at one of the coldest times of the year. So if you get one of these big troughs, one of the coldest times of the year, you increase the chances for very cold temperatures, potentially pushing through parts of California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona. This is, if we look closely at this forecast here, an 11 to 12 day forecast. So certainly not taking this verbatim. It is a signal there. We saw it kind of at the end of December creep up on some of the long range models that there was this kind of cold potential. And I always watch those more carefully, as we go through January, because it could be very cold given the kind of background state of the atmosphere is at its coldest as we go through January and into February as well. So keeping an eye on that next weekend for the kind of risk of a deeper freeze across the western U.S. Want to get another opinion, of course, so going over and looking at the ECMWF ensemble for that same time period. Again, an 11 to 12 day forecast from the ECMWF. Actually some pretty good agreement between the two models. They usually start to disagree. You get further out, there's less confidence, errors propagate. But despite that, ECMWF, GFS, both in agreement in this big trough settling in across the western U.S., getting out into next weekend, or at least kind of even very early to that next week as well. Way out in the forecast, the signal is there. There's some agreement in the models. This might be something we want to watch a little bit more carefully as we go through this next week here for potential cold. If we look at the forecast over the kind of same time frame, getting out into the end of next week into next weekend, shifting a bit drier. This from the GFS ensemble, looking at the 7-day precipitation anomaly out through January 7th. So rain events to talk about this weekend, potentially another system coming through Monday, and then a midweek system next week. Hints of maybe another system trying to sneak through California at the end of next week, maybe just ahead of some of that cold that we talked about, if that's going to come to fruition. But kind of looking as a whole, going out even beyond that, seeing a bit of a drier trend, and that lines up with what we saw in the MJO, right? The MJO going into the Eastern Hemisphere, usually, but not always, that tends to quiet things down a bit. So could be seeing a quieter pattern here, maybe through that second week of January, getting out into that 6 to 10 to 8 to 14 day time period. I say that, but if we look at the extended forecast, this from the ECMWF here, there's still this kind of wetter trend. This is a 30-day precipitation anomaly forecast starting January 6th, going out to February 6th, so a whole kind of 30-day forecast. And this is still wetter for the western U.S. Strangely enough, drier for the Sierra Nevadas, but wetter as a whole for much of the western U.S. Keeping an eye on this kind of trend right now. If we look at the Climate Prediction Center, their forecast for the month of January here, warmer across the northwest and then wetter across the west coast as well, with a particular focus here on Northern California, southwest Oregon. So with that El Nino background state, this might be just kind of a brief dry patch that we go through, and it could be that when we get into mid-January, we're talking about systems again, perhaps the MJO quickly swinging back around, coming through the Pacific once more, and there'll be more Pacific jet extensions to talk about. Some things I'll be watching here as we get into January. I think last week I mentioned El Niño strengthening right now. That's kind of another thing, is kind of the background state that we're working with. We thought El Niño might have peaked. I mentioned it might have peaked here at the end of November. This is the El Niño indices here, and if you look at the end of November, we had something of a peak there, and now it's strengthening again here at the end of December. We usually expect the peak in December or January, so it would not surprise me. The forecast continues to be kind of favorable for strengthening. If we do end up peaking here right at the end of December or early January, if we can top that peak that we had here in November. But this is all to say El Niño is still here. It's still strengthening. We're seeing that pattern. If you look over the last 14 days, it's looked very El Niño-y, for lack of a better word. I'm expecting that to continue to dominate the forecast as we go through January, February, and March, and hopefully work up some more snowpack in the Sierra Nevadas as we go through the new year. I think that's all I have for you all here today. Thank you for watching, and until next time.